Hello everyone. Today I'm trying out another automation game that isn't yet available on Steam. It's called Foundry. This game's alpha was available for a while on itch.io, but my understanding is that as of last year, access to the alpha has been discontinued as the game is transitioning to Steam. The developer is very active on Discord, and I'm including the link in the description if you're interested. And they said that they intend to have a demo available on the next Steam Next, which is, I think, coming up in October, if I remember right. If you previously purchased the game on itch, they do have an updated demo preview on the itch page right now. Anyways, the game is kind of similar to Tectonica in some ways, because it places a lot of emphasis on digging and automation, of course. But unlike Tectonica, there's no story or any sort of driving goal to the game, as far as I know. Right now, the game is just about making progress in the tech tree and making more and more complex items. The game uses these cube tiles that may remind you initially of Minecraft on a very superficial way. But, you know, all the game objects, they have their own geometry and they're not cubes. So, I mean, the game doesn't really look like a Minecraft clone in any way. But it does have the basic cube tiles to work with for the terrain. Like a lot of the automation games, Foundry uses a belt and inserter method for moving resources around. But their inserters, they don't have any external moving parts. There's just sort of a block that you put on top of a belt. And I don't think that there's any sort of rate limiter to their functionality. I think they work off of the rate of the belt that's attached to them, as far as I can tell. The power generation in the game is done through a mixture of solar power and combustion. Initially, you're going to be burning biomass that you get from the surface as you cut things down. And later on, you're going to be able to dig out this ore that's, you can basically think of it like coal, that you can burn in generators for power. Power is one way that this game is different from many other games, in that it differentiates, oh my gosh, high voltage versus low voltage power grids. It has an entire UI for looking at your power and seeing what's available. You can look at what's on the high voltage grid, and then how many transformers you have, and then what's being powered by those transformers, what the overall power limit is. Most of the factory items will use the low voltage grid, but there's a couple of things that do only use the high power voltage. So that sort of difference is kind of nice to see. You do have to manage that separately. The resources in the game, there's both solid and liquid resources, although right now the liquid resources are relatively deep into the tech tree and I actually have not yet played around with them very much. The resources deplete over time, so in a similar way to kind of like the early builds of Tectonica, but also they maybe don't deplete. Let me explain. Like initially, you're building drone mines on the surface. There are these ore deposits that you can basically exploit with these drone mines, and those will eventually deplete. It does take a while. You'll get quite a lot of resources out of these nodes, but eventually they will go down to zero. But before you spend too many hours in the game, really, you're going to get the ability to build subsurface resource scanners. Okay, that's going to be able that's basically going to tell you how deep down there's going to be a layer of ore that you can get to and exploit. Then what you do is you build an elevator, you tell it how deep to go, and then it'll basically dig a giant hole for you. You then take the elevator down, and using your drill or other methods, you can dig out a small cavern. In that cavern, you can then build a mining depot with a rail, okay? And it's got a drill that will use the rail to dig into the ore layer that you're in. It'll basically go in a straight line, and so as long as there's ore in that layer, it's going to spit it out into a little cart that's going to go back to the depot, and then you can distribute that around your factory. You can use a freight elevator to send everything up, and then process it above ground, or if you were willing to, you could dig out, I suppose, a giant cavern and then process things underground as well, as long as you had the time to dig out a cavern. The underground ore also is a little more complex as far as the processing of it than the stuff that you get above ground. Generally, it requires a few more steps. Like you have to crush it. Think of it like the sort of similar to the Tectonica ores. This one you have to crush, and then you can process it further in other machines. So right now you're probably starting to think, so what is it that you're trying to do in the game? Really, the end goal, as far as I can tell, is to just explore the tech tree, to build the next thing. Kind of like it can be in Factorio. You make progress in the game by first building a research lab, and then you feed it with research packets of various tiers to make progress, right? You can basically, you have a tech tree. You select the technology, and then that tech will have specific colored tech packets that are required to complete it. So then, as long as you are providing those to the research lab, the research will make progress until you eventually have fed enough research packets into your lab to complete the item. And if, as you go through this process, you unlock further different colored research packets. Each one that you unlock is more complex than the last, as you can expect. Requires more additional resources to build. And the way that it's worked in Foundry, you know, it's not just you need to have more assemblers to assemble the next doodad, but rather, you know, it requires a lot of times a new type of resource that you have to go get from somewhere. Like the liquid resources are introduced late into the game, at least late into the demo, I should say. And you know, the underground resources you end up needing kind of in the middle of the game. So yeah, the way that it works is that complexity is unlocked not just in the chain of items that need to be made and then assembled into a final item, but rather, you know, the resources as well get more complex. So in general, the complexity goes up quite a bit as you go up into the tech tree. And I think that's kind of the gist of the game, right? You are basically looking at an automation game where, like Factorio, it gets complex relatively quickly. The sort of limiting factor, if you will, is your patience and ability and desire to build. Okay, because for me, one thing that has been a bit of a, let's say, limiting factor is that digging with the drill has been an exercise in tenacity, I guess. Like if you have to dig an entire hill out because you're trying to make a base flat, then that could take 10 minutes of digging with the drill. That is just mind-numbing for me. I find myself almost falling asleep sometimes when I'm digging out large areas to try to make them flat. Well, instead, what I started doing is I started putting my bases up on floating, or not necessarily floating, but on these platforms, because then you don't have to deal with trying to make the land flat. If you're okay with doing that, or if you're okay with the digging portion, I think the game is really interesting. There's not really very many games exactly like this one, but of course there's lots of games that have different parts of this one. If you like automation games, if you don't mind the digging, or if you are okay with just building platforms to build factories in order to avoid the terrain, I think this game could be really interesting. And so do I recommend the game? I think absolutely yes. The caveat is that if you hate digging, it's probably not for you. The digging in Tectonica, if you think you're okay with digging because Tectonica's digging is totally fine, the digging in Foundry is much more onerous. You are going to end up wishing you had a mole in Foundry. But again, once you have the explosive charges, making underground chambers becomes much easier and faster. If you are it may be a slight problem is if you want to have your underground chambers to be a specific shape or something like that, then you're going to have to spend a lot of time sort of cleaning up what the underground charges make. But yeah, I think with the explosive charges, you can dig out large sections relatively fast. I think that part is totally fine. And I think that is really the biggest reason you might want to stay away from the game. The second, the reason that you might want to stay away from the game is if you just don't like the way it looks. I think it has a very specific look to it. It's I think it's totally fine. It works for me, but it's obviously not cutting edge graphics by any stretch of the imagination. But like I said, the complexity of the manufacturing chains that you can create in Foundry far outweigh anything that you can make in Tectonica right now. It's much more complex. Anyways, those have been my thoughts on Foundry. If you're still watching, thank you very much for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe. I'll catch you guys on the next one.